Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Inside Florida Politics Podcast, powered by the USA Today Florida Network.
The shooting death of Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk, while speaking at a Utah university, spoke to the gravity of political violence in America today. Not that Florida actually needed any kind of reminder of this. Just this week, for example, jury selection took place in Fort Pierce for the trial of Ryan Routh. He's the man arrested almost exactly a year ago on charges that he tried to assassinate now, again, President Donald Trump, who at the time was the GOP White House nominee. And finally, what's this Don versus Ron talk about the 2026 midterm elections? Hi, I'm Antonio Fins, host of the Inside Florida Politics Podcast, and these are the topics I'll be talking about today with my USA Today Florida Network colleague, John Kennedy. John, let's start with the tragedy involving the murder of Kirk, who was a well-known figure in Florida political circles. His Turning Point USA summits drew a lot of MAGA celebrities to South Florida, galvanized a lot of younger voters, and you can make a credible case that he had a hand in turning formerly purple Florida crimson red. And in fact, back in May, President Trump actually credited Kirk with one of the reasons that he did so well among younger voters in the 2024 elections that returned him to the White House. Is that an accurate way of describing Kirk's influence in Florida?
Well, Charlie Kirk was certainly active in this state. He regularly hosted Turning Point USA summits here, and earlier this year he made appearances at the University of Florida and Florida State University. His message combined a kind of devotion to evangelical Christianity with an intolerance for Muslims and gay people, while sending out a kind of a general distrust of Black people and a need for women to play a role primarily as a wife and mother. Yeah, he had a following in the state, and he fit in nicely in the overall MAGA universe. He was a major player and organizer for Trump here and elsewhere, and also for hard right politicians in the state and across the nation. And at this point, people across the political spectrum are condemning political violence and the act that cut down Kirk. We've seen far too much of it in recent months and years. But where we go now may be guided but most by where our political leaders take us. President Trump, though, was quick to condemn Democrats and the political left for what caused the shooting. And he was joined by several hard right members of Congress in blaming Democrats for throwing around terms like fascist when describing the views advanced by conservatives. Kind of the view being that that's inflaming political radicals that are going to take action like we saw with Kirk. Trump, though, he didn't look in the mirror, reflecting on his own use of harsh language and so many, the kind of words that so many others that he disagrees with, that he uses to really demonize them. Still, I don't think anyone wants to see the political atmosphere turned up any hotter and people getting into a warped sense of retaliatory response. But the idea that Kirk was martyred by the left and now the left must absorb some kind of punishment, that would be the worst of possible outcomes. So there's plenty of hyper-partisanism to go around right now. And sadly, there doesn't seem to be any willingness to dial things back.
Well, it's you made a couple of good points there. Let's break them down a bit here. Number one, I think the one common denominator is that once again, we are seeing pretty much across the board denunciations of political violence. And it needs to be said that there is no role for political violence in the American system. That is antithetical to everything that we stand for. But there's also a really cruel irony here. You talked about the fact that, Charlie Kirk's views on LGBTQ issues and on women and religion, and he was an evangelical. But nonetheless, there was also one other thing. He's a Second Amendment advocate. And here we are again with a shooting of a conservative figure, at a time when the conservative politics, and particularly far-right MAGA politics, is really ardently pro-Second Amendment, pro the ability of anybody, just about anybody, to obtain a firearm. And it's particularly interesting, though, and somewhat cruel that, that we see this, and it doesn't seem to resonate that maybe there are certain people in society that probably should not have access to a weapon. We talked to Carl Cascio of the Palm Beach County Republican Party yesterday, and he made the point that we don't have a gun problem in this country. We have a mental illness and culture problem in the United States. And well, maybe so, but at the same time, and Carl made the argument, well, if they don't have a firearm, they'll have a knife. Yeah, but I think that you can make a critical argument, and people have made a credible argument too, that at least an attacker with a knife, you may see them coming at you, you can defend yourself. In this case, Charlie Kirk was giving a speech, and from 200 yards away, somebody with a fire killed him with one shot. So it just seems that in Florida, you've written a lot about this disconnect between the ability, violence, mass shootings, violence, and the propensity of the state's policy to continue to be way more relaxed on gun policy.
Well, Antonio, one thing that happened just hours before the tragic shooting of Charlie Kirk was Governor DeSantis and the Attorney General, James Uthmeyer, were hailing an appeals court ruling. It was a panel of the First District Court of Appeal that found that the state's ban on open carry of firearms was unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. And the reason that DeSantis and Uthmeyer and others were hailing this decision was they have been advocating for a while, for a couple of years, that Floridians should be allowed to, openly display weapons. And, here this ruling would move in that direction, and it might inspire the legislature when it reconvenes in January to take up that open carry law and pass it. Just last year, the Senate President, Ben Albritton, who is a arch conservative, he refused to advance that legislation because law enforcement opposes open carry. The law enforcement in the community, by way of the Florida Sheriff's Association, the Florida Police Chiefs Association, have spoken out against open carry because, the kind of view is if everybody is carrying a weapon, it's kind of hard to tell who's the bad guy maybe at times. Mm-hmm. And that's something that just from a tactical point of view, law enforcement agencies do not want to have to address. But anyway, that's by way of getting to the point that you're raising, that Florida's culture that is so pro-gun, how do we reconcile that with these kind of shootings that occur? Because that's one of the things that's kind of curious about this shooting of Charlie Kirk as well, that we won't, here I'm getting ahead of whatever police outcome may come of this and who gets apprehended for this awful shooting. But you don't think of the hard left as having somebody that can, fire a long range rifle from 250 yards away and shoot somebody on a platform. Those do not seem to be the qualities that you normally associate with the liberal progressive left. But anyway, we will find out more as this investigation continues. But the blaming of the left is kind of curious right now, too.
Yeah, well, we're also going to find out a lot more about another near tragedy here in Florida, and that was about this time a year ago, the Ryan Routh case, where he is accused of having staked out then candidate Trump on his golf course in West Palm Beach at Trump International. At that time, Trump was playing the fifth hole. Ryan Routh is accused of being in the bushes with a long rifle, aiming at the area around the sixth hole. And he is, he is on trial now as we speak in that case. He was apprehended later on, and now he's on trial, and we're going to find out a lot more about his motives. Although we have already found out quite a bit that he basically was taking aim at the president for allegedly, at least, for political reasons. He did not agree apparently with the president's policies. So again, we have somebody deciding to take matters into their own hands and deciding who gets to speak and who gets a platform and not. And I think that's, again, we're going to learn a lot more about that case. There have been other cases that with potential, of shootings, the one in Butler, Pennsylvania. We've never really heard a lot about Thomas Crooks. who was killed at that moment by a Secret Service sharpshooter at the moment that he opened fire on President Trump during that speech, and actually killed one of the attendees, a firefighter from the Butler, Pennsylvania area. So it just seems that political violence is we don't like. We see ourselves as a democracy where we settle issues at the ballot box, but we seem to be in an era right now where not everybody agrees, and they're taking matters into their own hands and trying to settle things with violence. So let's talk a little bit, Amon. Up until this terrible violence, this shooting in Utah, John, that the political verse is still squarely attentive to the Epstein drama. The MAGA base has been a stalwart and indivisible electorate for a decade now behind President Trump. But the Epstein case has driven a wedge between Trump's loyal voters. Trump has seemingly been able to successfully curate just about every narrative to his devoted audience, except this one. He's not been able to basically put this matter, quell the uproar over the demand that the government release all Epstein files. He's called it a dead issue. He's called it a Democratic hoax. He's called it a distraction from all the great things his administration is doing. And yet it has been bought. That argument hasn't been bought, and specifically hasn't been bought by the MAGA base. Why has this issue been the exception, do you think?
Yeah, this is something that was, really hyper promised by Trump and by later by Attorney General Pam Bondi, for a long time. And the MAGA universe has been awaiting, all documents, complete transparency in the Epstein case. And we have not been getting that. And what little we have been getting so far, implicates Trump as a good friend, close associate of Jeffrey Epstein. What does that mean? That remains still the subject of some level of investigation right now. But I think this MAGA universe was so indoctrinated with the idea that the Epstein case was going to shine a bright light on, the deep state, and probably a lot of Democrats or Democratic allied people that were benefiting from their association with Epstein or involved in criminal activity with Epstein. Now, instead, it appears that in these documents, there's a lot of Trump, as a lot of people, even back in the day when the Trump people were advocating for release of more Epstein information, thought that, yeah, Trump's name is going to appear in there. But yeah, as you point out, now Trump's defense seems to be denying everything and, raising questions about the credibility of anything. His signature, it's not his signature on the birthday greeting to Epstein that has become so publicized. And then he gets members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, to also say, oh, yeah, I've seen Trump's signature. There's no way that's his signature. So there's this long roster right now of people that are supporting the denial. But I don't know. How long do you keep creating that narrative that this is all a falsehood? We've seen in the social media world that can work. And maybe that's what Trump feels, that if he holds on long enough and denies, that this story will eventually recede. And there may be a chance that it will.
Yeah, but here's what I think. I think this is what I find really fascinating about this issue from a political perspective, is that it appears to be the first time that the president seems to be misreading his base. The question of sexual abuse is something that is intrinsically and it is one of the top priorities, public policy priorities of the base. Look how many issues that issue covers through. Immigration, we hear about child sex trafficking through the border. The LGBTQ, the bathroom issue, we hear about the idea that there's going to be, we don't want, children in bathrooms with men. Even the QAnon element with the Pizzagate, issue of a few years ago. Yeah. This issue of sexual abuse really cuts through a number of issues in that base. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why it has such staying power, because it's not just Epstein. It seems to me, and this is what, and I've been to many, many, many rallies, and I've spoken to a lot of people at those rallies, and this is a recurring theme. And it strikes me that perhaps what's happening here is that it's not just Epstein, it is the bigger picture of this real intense focus on sexual abuse, and particularly of children, that is a very important issue within the base. And it seems to have now been, just kind of manifested in this Epstein scandal. So it's going to be, I think that speaks to one of the reasons why he's having such trouble getting his own electorate. Forget the Democrats, forget the independents don't like him. His own base of people that are been with him for a decade. That I think this speaks to one of the reasons why he's having such a hard time marshaling them back behind his position. But in any case, hey, look, here we go. It's September. If you haven't, we've been busy with politics. We haven't realized that, we've only got 3 months left in 2025, which means that the 2026 midterm election year is just a little bit more than 100 days away. John, it was just like 2 months ago or so that President Trump and Governor DeSantis were being buddy-buddy at the Alligator Alcatraz tour. But it seems now that rivalry is developing like a late fall tropical wave. Tell us about some of the races in which the governor and the president might be fielding different candidates.
That's right. You're right. Back in the Alligator Alcatraz days, you're right. Trump talked about how the relationship with DeSantis was a 9 out of 10. So that sounded like it was a big change from where it had been. But now we're starting to see those numbers change. There's a battle brewing between Governor DeSantis and the Trump team for the future control of the home state of both men. We're seeing the latest example now with Team Trump urging House Speaker Danny Perez to run for the office of Florida Attorney General next year, challenging DeSantis's appointed Attorney General and former Chief of Staff, James Uthmeyer. There's also speculation that Team Trump is recruiting a very wealthy Florida House member, Kevin Steele, a Republican from the Tampa area, to run against Chief Financial Officer Blaise Ngolia, who's another DeSantis appointee. We already have the rivalry that has been underway between DeSantis people and Byron Donalds, who has been the endorsed Trump candidate for governor next year. But now you're starting to wonder, how far will this go with the back and forth on, there are candidates next year, Republican candidates that are backed by DeSantis, and then there is a slate of candidates next year that are backed by the president. Who's going to have the biggest influence over Florida politics going forward past 2026? Trump, is a frequent flyer to Mar-a-Lago. He has a strong affinity for this state, has a lot of business interests still here, and wants to shape the future of politics. And it's also kind of an ego thing. It shows that he can command at the state level as well, which he can. DeSantis is in the closing months of his term as governor, and his influence is diminishing because people are looking past DeSantis. We've heard of DeSantis and possibly First Lady Casey DeSantis running for governor next year. DeSantis has recently appointed a new lieutenant governor, Jay Collins, a former state senator, also from the Tampa area. And it's widely seen that he is being positioned as a run for governor as well. But this idea that Trump would put up a slate of candidates for some of the state's top offices, the governor and cabinet, that says something. And it also says something about the relationship between Trump and DeSantis. Remember, the chief of staff for Donald Trump is Susie Wiles, a Jacksonville political consultant who once worked for Ron DeSantis and was very unceremoniously, unseated from the DeSantis world a few years ago. She wound up back with Donald Trump, who she also had formerly worked for. And I think there is a revenge factor there, that Susie Wiles is no fan of Ron DeSantis. And there's a way for her to kind of get back at the governor by taking over the state party on behalf of her new boss, Donald Trump. So that's the kind of dynamic that's in play right now. We're still months away from candidate qualifying, and we're also months away from what may be a redistricting session, which also plays into Trump's goal of trying to increase Republican seats in the U.S. House so that he can withstand what is almost always a loss of seats by the party in power in the midterm elections. Trump wants to retain the kind of control of Washington that he has right now. So we may have a redistricting session in Florida too, which somewhat ironically, DeSantis also is supporting, even though DeSantis is largely the maker of the congressional maps that we're using right now that have given Republicans 20 of Florida's 28 seats. So there's a lot of political dynamic right now between Trump world and DeSantis world.
Yeah, a lot of dynamic, and we don't expect DeSantis and Trump to be on the ballot. Certainly not Trump in 2026. But as you said, it's going to be sort of has this Ron versus Don backdrop to the we may have to the 2026 election. Well, that's our show for this time. Again, I want to thank our production guru, Rob Landers, for all the work he does on our podcast and all the hard work of our colleagues across the USA Today Florida network who really help us, inform us, and make this podcast happen. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.